Hi, I'm David Marchant, the founder of OffshoreAlert, which investigates participants in high-value cross-border finance with an emphasis on high-confidentiality jurisdictions. Our specialty is exposing investment fraud while it's in progress. Enjoy our content.
Good afternoon or good evening where I am. My name is Tom Winnifrith. My nickname is the Sheriff of AIM. The AIM Casino is a junior market in London which has been rampant with frauds more or less since it started 25 years ago. And I've exposed an awful lot of them. I was given the nickname the Sheriff of AIM by a British aristocrat. It subsequently emerged he was engaged in industrial scale welfare fraud and he was sent to prison, but that's another matter. I've exposed a lot of companies on the AIM market, from tiny little 1 to 3 million companies, which are just lying and running out of other people's money, right up to the biggest fraud on the AIM market, Quindel, a company capitalized at round about $5 billion. At its peak. Its management are still being investigated by the useless regulators in the United Kingdom, and I do have some hope that they will go where they deserve, that is to say, prison. A few years ago, I encountered a gentleman called Neil Woodford. I moved away from my home territory of investigating smaller companies to take on Neil Woodford. Before I get there, just one little story about the crazy times we live in. I live in Wales, which is a country next to England. Don't ask me about the political setup in this country. It's all too mad to start with. If I look out of my window here, I see Wales. If I look to my left, I see a river, the River Dee, and on the other side live the English infidels. Right now, in lockdown, if I want to walk out of my door and go 300 yards to the pub in the village, you might call it a bar in America, I would not be able to get in. That's because the pubs in Wales are all closing at 6 o'clock because that's when coronavirus comes out. And as a bonus, they're not allowed to serve any alcohol. So before 6 o'clock, I can go to a pub in Wales and I can drink soft drinks or eat food. If I walk 300 yards further on, I get to the first pub in England. There, I can have alcohol, but only if I order a substantial meal. But a substantial meal can just be a meat pie. When I've finished my substantial meal, I am not allowed to have any more alcohol, but I can have a soft drink or a cup of cocoa, because having a cup of cocoa doesn't spread COVID, whereas having a pint of beer does. Crazy, all within 300 yards. Anyhow, we live in mad times, but from mad times today to mad fund managers, that is to say, Neil Woodford. Neil Woodford was, I suppose I should say who I am first. I'm not a short seller. There will be one or two people speaking at this conference, no doubt, who are short sellers. I am just a journalist. I always feel that if I were to be short of a stock, people wouldn't be able to view me as offering impartial comment. And therefore, I deliberately never go short of stocks. I make my money because people subscribe to Share Profits, the website that I run and work on with 5 or 6 other colleagues, and people pay to access our material. I have been recognised by a number of people for exposing fraud. The accounting regulators, the Financial Reporting Council, have commended my work on a number of occasions, saying that they opened or extended investigations, including into Quindel, as a result of my submissions. The chairman of the London Stock Exchange told the AGM that he was a big fan of my work. Why am I able to do this work? Because 8 years ago, I was nearly bankrupt. I had been taking time out from journalism to become a crony capitalist, working on the other side. The business all went up in flames. and I was nearly bankrupt. I went back to investigative journalism, and since then, over the past 8 years, have exposed dozens and dozens of frauds. That is the sort of activity which gets you a lot of hostility. Last weekend, I had someone call me up on a private number, and he said, "How did your mother die? How did your mother die?" And he went on with the same phrase for a little while. In the end, I said, "It's no secret. Yes, she killed herself. What's your point?" That's the sort of hostility that I get. I get death threats. My wife, they've attempted to get folks who own shares in companies I've exposed, have attempted to get her sacked from her work. That's the sort of thing that I have. And that brings me to another speaker who is speaking at your conference and who also comes from Britain, Margaret Hodge MP. I am an amazing admirer of Margaret Hodge MP, of her work in the past 3 or 4 years. She has stood up to anti-Semitism within her party, the Labour Party, the Socialist Party, and for doing that and for standing up to the leader of the Labour Party, who I think encouraged the culture of anti-Semitism, Margaret Hodge has received the sort of trolling that it just puts my stuff into perspective. Industrial scale trolling, a lot of death threats, a lot of harassment of Margaret Hodge. And Margaret Hodge has responded by saying that it would be better for society if the anonymity which allows people to behave in this way on the internet was rescinded. You wouldn't be able to tweet out something without folks knowing who you are. You wouldn't be able to post things on Facebook, etc. I disagree with Margaret Hodge. One of the things which makes my job possible is that people can come to you as a whistleblower. They can speak out because they are protected by anonymity. I'm afraid that folks like me as a journalist, Margaret Hodge as a politician, or indeed the journalists who exposed industrial scale child abuse in the borough that Margaret Hodge once ran and who were smeared as homophobes for doing so very wrongly. I worked on the same paper as them. When we expose things, we expect to get flack. It is important that whistleblowers can be protected by anonymity. And therefore, I disagree with Margaret Hodge's proposals that whistleblowers would in some way be outed. That would be regrettable. I digress slightly. Who was Neil Woodford? Neil Woodford was a fund manager, and he had a heroic career working for another firm, for a big firm called Invesco. He started there in the 1990s, and he made 2 quite amazing macroeconomic calls, gutsy calls, which made him famous. The first was he didn't buy into that dot-com rubbish in the late 1990s. For a while, his funds underperformed all those funds which were invested in dot-com rubbish, rather like Warren Buffett. People said Woodford has lost his touch, but then he was vindicated. He'd been happily investing in value investments, companies that did things like paying a dividend, making a profit, having asset backing, generating cash, all those things which back in 1999 were regarded as old world and irrelevant. That was his first big macro call, and he emerged from that as a hero. Then in the late 2000s, we had the great financial crisis. Woodford had no or minimal exposure to banks and financial institutions. So once again, that had hurt his performance in 2006, 2007. But come 2008, he was a total hero. And as a result, he was absolutely beloved by private investors and beloved by the financial press. The Daily Mail, a tawdry right-wing rag read widely across Middle England by the British middle class, used to describe Woodford as Britain's Buffett. The BBC, our state-run broadcaster, said that Woodford was, quote, the man who made Middle England rich. I didn't share this view. When in 2013, Neil Woodford left Invesco and set up his own fund management business, I didn't cover him. It wasn't an area in which I was a great expert. My expertise is in looking at smaller companies. So I had no interest whatsoever in Woodford. But I didn't join in the near universal praise that Woodford received. Fund platforms like Hargreaves Lansdown, the biggest fund platform in this country, made sure that all of their clients knew that they had to have exposure to Neil Woodford's new funds. My first contact with Woodford was in 2015. From 2015, I started calling the man out. I explicitly said in 2015 that people should have no exposure whatsoever to the two open-ended trusts and the one closed-end trust which Woodford ran. In the years that followed, I have been responsible for something like 1,200 written articles, podcasts, and video presentations on Neil Woodford. The wider mainstream media continued to praise Woodford. They didn't turn on him until the bitter end, which was in 2019. I had been well ahead of the pack, and I had been quite openly calling him out as a con artist and a swindler and a charlatan from 2016 onwards. How can I say that? How am I able to say that? And how was I able to say that when the whole world, certainly all of my fellow professional journalists, were saying that folks had to be buying Woodford units? Don't know if you can see this. I'm not very good at PowerPoint, so they're very, very small, the Neil Woodford red flags. Before I come to red flags, which you can always spot, my friend Sam Antar, who many of you may have heard of, the former finance director at the Crazy Eddie's fraud, always says that your three most valuable sources as a fraud buster are the three X's: ex-wives and lovers, ex-employees, and ex-business partners and associates. Those are the people who always come forward. In exposing the Quindell fraud, I actually had two ex-wives of senior managers at Quindell come forward to me. I won't name them because I always protect my sources, but they were ex-wives of very senior figures within the Quindell organization, and they knew enough of where the bodies were buried to be useful. They hated their husbands and they were looking for revenge. There were a number of ex-employees of Quindell who came forward with Woodford. It wasn't ex-employees, it wasn't ex-wives, although he did trade in his missus for a younger model at some stage. It was more people who had done business with him, not so much business partners as associates. And one of those was the first person to come forward. It was an industry insider from within fund management. As I said, this is not really my area of expertise. I once was a fund manager, bloody useless one. But it wasn't an area which I studied at that time, but I was persuaded to have a look at it by this fellow who pointed out the first big red flag is that the day after Neil Woodford left Invesco to set up his new business, Invesco was wrapped over the knuckles by the financial regulator in this country, the FCA, which is so incredibly useless that to be wrapped over the knuckles really does require some doing. That Invesco was wrapped over the knuckles on 38 different counts of breaking the rules of fund management. They were to do with liquidity, concentration of positions, that sort of thing. And guess what? Every single count was to do with funds run by Neil Woodford. That should have been a bit of a red flag. The Deadwood press, the mainstream media, had not picked up on this, or they hadn't reported it widely. So keen were they to tell folks that they must invest in Woodford. But to me, that is an enormous red flag, to break that many rules and to actually get the FCA ticking you off. That is a big thing, and it does sort of explain why he left Invesco. The other thing which I had my attention drawn to was that in his latter years at Invesco, Neil Woodford had not done what he had done in his first period of time at Invesco. Woodford's reputation was made by backing value investments, those sort of dull engineering companies which make profits and generate cash and pay a dividend, buying into them at the right time and holding. Classic sort of Buffettology investment. But in his last few years at Invesco, in a desperate search to deliver beta, to keep the money coming in to his funds, Woodford had strayed off course. He had started investing in biotech companies, for instance, and also in smaller private technology businesses, the sort of companies which were cash guzzlers and would never pay a dividend or wouldn't be paying a dividend for many years, yet he would buy shares in them and put them in funds which had income in the name, i.e. funds which should have been yielding more than the market. And what my contact within the industry said, who did have first-hand knowledge of doing business with Woodford, was that this pattern of behaviour, which had been evident in the last few years at Invesco, was even more evident in the first couple of years of the new business. He launched his funds. He'd received £8 billion of private investor money, which is a lot of money in the United Kingdom. He'd been, most of it pushed in by the Daily Mail, the newspaper, and Hargreaves Lansdown, the platform. But with the Deadwood Press, universal in its praise, he'd received all that money. And desperate to show that he was not losing the Midas touch, which he'd had at Invesco, Woodford departed from the rules pretty quickly, making large investments in unquoted businesses, in unprofitable businesses, in businesses whose shares would be hard to trade if you were a forced seller, in businesses which were nowhere near paying a dividend or making a profit, and which would need repeat funding going forward. And he was making quite sizable investments in that, not just 5-6% of his portfolio, but 20 or 30% of his portfolio. And that was a desperate attempt by Woodford in the early years of setting up his own business, Woodford Investment Management, in order to deliver superior performance in order to attract in more investors' money. What other alarming signals or red flags out there? And one of them was the relationship with another company called IP Group. IP Group is an investment company. Its shares are listed, I think, on AIM, or is it the main market? I think it is on AIM. And Woodford took a large stake in IP Group via his funds. IP Group would typically invest in unquoted businesses, and those would be the sort of businesses which Woodford was also investing in. It really was a nest of vipers. IP Group, Woodford had his big stake in IP Group, and therefore he wanted its net asset value to go up. IP Group would invest in a private company on a 20 million valuation, and then it would do another funding round further down the track, and Woodford would put money in on a 200 million valuation. Well, it's great news for IP Group. Not necessarily such good news for Woodford with his 200 million valuation, but it's a private company, so you can keep these things going for a long, long time. The big winner, of course, would be shareholders in IP Group, because its net asset value would go through the roof, and the biggest shareholder in IP Group was Neil Woodford. It wasn't the only such company where there were a similar potential conflicts of interest. There were a number of these things which Woodford had invested in, and they were investing in companies, and then Woodford was investing in those companies at higher rates. That's the sort of thing which really should send alarm bells. It's an obvious red flag. And then there were some very strange investments that Woodford made himself. There was a company called Version, which was listed on the AIM casino. Woodford had put in quite a lot of money at well north of 100 pence, well north of £1. But the trouble was that Versian, which was a technology business, was just running out of money. Death stared it in the face. The Grim Reaper was staring down at Versian. The shares plummeted to just 72 British pence. It was obvious at that time that if Versian the market and go bust. So what did Woodford do? Woodford went to the company and said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you another 10 million sterling, what's it, 9 million sterling, and we'll do it at 105p. We'll do it at a massive premium to your current share price. Now, normally, when a company is staring down the barrels of bankruptcy, if it gets a refinance, it does so at a much lower level. It does it at a huge discount to the current market price. That didn't happen with Versian. Woodford was prepared to pay a premium, and of course the effect was that his existing holding, which was where he put in a multiple of what he was doing in the bailout refinancing, was marked up. It boosted the funds under management, boosted the fees which Mr. Woodford could take out of his funds, and made his performance look a bit less mediocre. Of course, it ended in tears. Versian was delisted and the shares are now completely worthless. Tough luck if you are an investor in a Woodford fund. As I noted earlier, my big strength, or what I've made a career out of, is investing, is analysing smaller companies which are either grotesquely over-promoted or are outright frauds, or which have clearly implausible business models. And that was how in 2016, myself and my colleagues on Share Profits moved into the attack with Neil Woodford. There were a number of companies which he had invested in, either through his two unit trusts, both of which laughably said that they were income funds or income and growth funds, and both of which, by the time Mr. Woodford got sacked and the funds had to be wound down and redistributed to unit holders due to a liquidity crisis, were yielding way below the market average. But Woodford would make huge investments for those funds, and also for an investment trust, Woodford Patient Capital Trust, in such in companies which failed all of the red flag tests. I bring up 4 as examples, not in particular order. RM2 was a business which claimed to be disrupting the world of wooden pallets. You know, the pallets, you order a load of bricks for your house, they arrive on a wooden pallet. It typically costs about £5 to replace a wooden pallet if it is stolen. There's not much theft of them, but it costs about £5. RM2 had a cunning plan where it would sell folks pallets made not of wood, but of plastic with a chip in them, and it would charge folks £70 for that pallet. So if your pallet is stolen, you can trace it. You can go to those criminals who've stolen the pallets. The nearest big city to me is Liverpool. I can go and chase down those armed criminals and get my pallet back. Or alternatively, I could have just bought a wooden pallet for £5, and if it's stolen, I'll buy another one. It's clearly an absolutely bonkers business model. Neil Woodford was very keen on companies that said they were going to disrupt something. So RM2 was going to disrupt the world of wooden pallets, an industry which needs no disruption at all. There was another company he invested in which was going to disrupt the world of drinking water. Another one that was going to disrupt the world of washing machines. They had fanciful business plans. The management were just fleecing it, but Woodford put in hundreds of millions of dollars. And sometimes he did so on very strange valuations. One of the biggest investments that Woodford made was in a company called Benevolent AI. Initially, Woodford invested quite a large sum of money in Benevolent AI on a $200 million valuation. Some months later, he invested a tiny amount of money on a 1.2 billion valuation. He promptly used the second fundraise to mark up the value of his initial holding. It was massive, a massive kicker for his unit trust and investment trust, more management fees for Woodford. But the scale of the second investment, it was tiny compared to the first one. The madness continued. There was another funding round at 2 billion. Most of that came from a gentleman who was also doing a corporate deal with Benevolent AI and taking out the money that he put in via the back door. Woodford compounded that by putting in another small amount, and hey ho, all the valuations were lifted up again. You can see it's crazy. Should I be allowed to go and invest £1,000 or £100,000 in a company in a big fundraising, and then 6 weeks later invest £1.50 in a company at a much higher valuation and mark up my initial holding? Well, that's what Woodford did. It wasn't just at Benevolent AI. He did this on a number of occasions. And of course, when Woodford was no longer able to fund these cash guzzling monsters, what happened? Their next funding rounds were much, much lower level. As I think the next one for Benevolent AI was at just $750 million. The valuations in the Woodford funds, all of the funds, were just crackers. They were bogus. Thin Film was another company. Woodford invested over $100 million in this company. It's a Norwegian company. It was making smart labels, a label on a product so you can track it. There's no need for that. There's no need to disrupt the world of smart labels. Amazingly, over 3.5 years ending in 2017, the company managed to generate sales of $16.3 million. But in the same period, it burned its way through almost $140 million of cash, most of it provided by Neil Woodford. Woodford continued to put money into it as it was more and more clear that as sales budged very little, the cash burn was getting ever higher. It was clear the company was only solvent because Woodford put more and more money in at higher valuations. I don't think you need to do that much of a Google search to find out that Thin Film ended in tears. Perhaps the most shocking example of Woodford's A, appalling analysis, and B, also corruption, is Rutherford International, originally called Proton Partners. This was a private company, and at the start of 2019, it was 2018, at the start of whichever year it was, Rutherford International was technically insolvent. Woodford had put money in, quite a lot of money, valuations of 64 million quid, 15 million quid, 150 million quid for this business, but it remained private. By the time Rutherford came to IPO, Woodford was having a little bit of a problem with most of his funds in that he had more than 10% of the funds in unlisted investments. For the unit trust, that was a breach of the rules in the United Kingdom. You can only have 10% or less in unlisted vehicles. So there was a real imperative to float Rutherford International. If you could float it, he could reduce his holding in unquoted companies. And also if he could float it at a premium to the previous funding rounds, he could have a markup in his funds, charge more as management fees, make more money, get even richer. Have I mentioned, by the way, that in the 5 or 6 years that Neil Woodford ran Woodford Investment Management, whilst investors typically lost anything up to 50% of their money, Neil Woodford took nearly 100 million quid out of the business in management fees. It's nice work if you can get it. Anyhow, back to Rutherford International. The company flagged up through its pliant journalists in the Deadwood media that the company was going to be raising 50 million quid at a valuation of 400 million. 400 million for a company that had never achieved any sales whatsoever. It was trying to develop a new proton beam cancer therapy. but 50 million quid on a 400 million valuation for a business with zero historic sales and which was technically insolvent. That was flagged up. The fundraising failed. No one was prepared to put a cent in at that valuation. Therefore, Woodford faced the very real possibility that his business, which he'd invested a lot of money in, would go bankrupt, that he wouldn't be able to solve the investing rules about having more than 10% of your funds in unquoted businesses. What therefore happened was that Woodford stepped into the gap with other people's money, putting in 20 million and guaranteeing that the company could draw down on an additional 80 million at the 400 million valuation. And of course, it has drawn down on all of that because it continues to be a cash guzzling, worthless enterprise. The point here is that Woodford didn't need to go in at the higher price. Going in at the higher price allowed him to mark up the value of his investments at the lower levels, so actually boosted his funds under management and therefore made him richer. But he didn't need to because he was the only person. There are 75 million of us in this island, and 74,999,999 of us didn't want to invest in this company. Woodford was the only one. So he could have called the price. Now, I challenged him on this. One of the things that I like doing is to confronting people face to face. As if you check on my website, you'll see some very good photos I took of a Greek fraud called Folly. I went to its headquarters north of Athens. I do have a house in Greece, so I love the country. And I went there and tried to take photographs of this headquarters of this fraudulent company, which Gabriel Grego had exposed and I'd done some work on. And I was chased away by burly security guards who tried to seize my camera. Woodford didn't go that far, but he had an AGM coming up for its investment, for his investment trust. And I heard that he was going to exclude the media, so I bought 10 shares in it. That cost me £8. I think I've lost about £4 or £5 on that, but it was a great investment because I turned up to the AGM, which was in the city of my birth, Oxford, and the Woodford goons promptly told the Financial Times and other papers that they couldn't come in, but they couldn't keep me out. And so I went to the AGM, and as a loyal shareholder, having invested £8 in Mr. Woodford's investment trust, I asked a number of questions, which I think made a lot of the other people in the room question why on earth they were backing Woodford. One of them was about Rutherford International, Proton Partners. Why, when you're the only person in the whole of the United Kingdom, were you prepared to invest at that level, Neil? Said I. Is it anything to do with marking up the value of your other funds? Woodford insisted that he'd had third-party verification. Well, I don't believe him. The real verification is, of course, Mr. Market. The business was listed on a very junior market in the UK, lower than AIM. It was then called Next Markets. It's now called Aquis. And I think since Rutherford listed, which was 18 months ago, the value of shares traded is something like £5,000. £5,000 when your market cap is a nominal 400 million sterling. It's crackers. It's clear that when Woodford was doing that, A, he was trying to bend the rules to hide the fact that he'd had a rule breach, and B, he was just investing in grotesquely overvalued companies. It was one of a long list. If you go to share profits, you'll find we exposed 30, 40, 50, 60 companies. There were also bigger companies which got into big financial trouble. Woodford just averaged down. He insisted that with companies like Kia, a construction company in dire trouble, he knew best. He knew better than the market. Yes, the dividend was safe. Of course, it had a refinancing like so many of the other things he invested in. Bottom-up analysis is always the key. Facing a liquidity crisis, this was something that was very easy to track with the fund manager. We did a daily service on share profits where we would track the stated cash position of Woodford and work out how much of a liquidity crisis he was facing. By 2017, Woodford was facing problems. He'd invested in so many dogs that even some of the Deadwood press by the end of 2017 were picking up on the fact that this was not the sort of fund manager you want to back. He therefore faced a number of squeezes. Firstly, his quoted companies were in too many cases dogs. They underperformed and they were cash guzzlers, as were the private companies. Investors were wising up to the underperformance of Woodford and therefore were redeeming their units in large slugs. The only way he could keep going was to sell things he could sell, things like AstraZeneca, Lloyd's Bank, big blue chips. So gradually, the portfolios in all of his funds became more and more concentrated, less and less liquid. And that only compounded his problems as the underperformance continued. There were more and more redemptions. It accelerated. In the end, the regulator had to step in and gate the funds that Woodford managed because the redemptions were just swamping him. But he tried to keep this going for a while. He also patently told untruths to investors and bent the rules to hide the fact that whereas he was only meant to have 10% of his companies in unlisted, of his funds in unlisted investments, the real number was way north of that, heading towards 20%. So he would do things like float private companies on the obscure stock exchange in the Channel Islands, tax dodging haven between Britain and France. And the only shares that would list on these markets were the ones owned by Neil Woodford. So there was never any trade in them, but he tried to pretend that they were no longer unquoted investments, but were quoted investments. Eventually, even the useless FCA, our regulator here, saw through that one. And that had to be put a stop to. There were other things which Mr. Woodford would do. If you have a holding as a fund manager in a private company, but you know that it's going to float, you can say it's going to float within 12 months, therefore we'll treat it as a quoted asset. Woodford would do this and then companies would not float. So there was at least one company where he then sold his shares back to the company because the 12 months had expired. Then he bought them back again. And then he said it was going to float within 12 months and it therefore became a quoted entity. There were transfers between funds. He would transfer between the unit trusts and the investment trust, which had no such limit on how much unquoted equity it could own. By the end, the investment trust was 80% invested in unquoted stuff and facing its own liquidity crisis. But there were interesting transfers. Clearly, the unit trusts were forced sellers. The investment trust was nominally run by a board, but Woodford pulled all the strings. How did they decide the valuation? Again, Woodford, when I challenged him at his AGM, insisted that they'd gone to third-party valuers, but that wasn't the case. When one party is a forced seller, it has to sell, otherwise the FCA is going to come and close you down. How can you say there's a third-party valuation? A forced seller should take anything he was doing. Essentially, he screwed the people in the unit, in the investment trust, to get him out of regulatory difficulties with the unit trust. In the end, what did for Woodford was liquidity. He found himself invested in very few companies that paid dividends, even though he was nominally running income funds or equity and income funds. Very few companies that paid dividends, vast numbers of companies which needed cash. And he was facing redemptions. In the end, he just couldn't hide it any longer. I challenged him about the issue of liquidity at the AGM of his investment trust, and quite simply, Woodford lied. He said that I was well known for making things up. There was no issue about liquidity. When you get someone who is running either a fund or running a PLC, and you can look them in the eye and you can see that they are lying to you, then you know there's no need to get involved. That is the ultimate red flag. I've always said this about smaller companies. You find something which is a tiny lie. And once you find the tiny lie, if a company is prepared to broach, okay, the regulators in Britain are useless, so they're not really risking something, but it's just possible that there would be a new broom at the FCA. And if you tell a lie as a director or as a fund manager, you should be in deep, deep trouble. So any company prepared to tell a small lie is almost certainly telling much bigger lies. I'm having a battle with a company on AIM at the moment, which claimed to have announced an arm's length transaction with a company in Poland, which validated its technology. It turns out the company in Poland, as I've exposed, is run by a 33-year-old young lady and was only set up 3 or 4 weeks before the deal and only has 100 quid to its name. And the fact that it paid money to this AIM-listed company, it's called Powerhouse Energy, by the way, a stonking sell, is because the 33-year-old's boyfriend is the 67-year-old largest shareholder in the AIM company. I think that you could safely say that the Powerhouse Energy is a related party between the sheets transactions not being declared. That is a small deception. If you nail it for one thing, you can be pretty sure that you'd be able to nail it for a lot more things if you keep digging, which I will be. Powerhouse is exactly the sort of company that Neil Woodford would have invested in. But it is a golden rule of investment, is that you keep on pushing where you find a company which is either lying or is misleading investors, or a fund manager which is doing that. You know that in the end, it will end in tears. Thank you very much for your time. I'll have a sip from my Margaret Thatcher coffee mug here, something you don't boast about here in socialist Wales. If you have any questions, fire away.
Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to our investigative news and documents service and attending our events. For more information, visit offshorealert.com.